Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Occasionally, I get the chance to hear from one of you who happens to be related to a pirate somewhere in your family tree. Which is awesome, just objectively a cool factoid to discover about your family. I'm not so lucky myself. Aside from a few potential Vikings, the best I've got is a sailor on a voyage of Sir Walter Raleigh. Which would be fine if it was one of Raleigh's cool voyages, but this particular mission was a voyage to Guinea. Not exactly something to be proud of. Today, though, we're going to be talking about a pirate who has descendants living in England and America to this very day, some of whom even carry his last name. However, to say they're descendants isn't exactly accurate. As far as I know, Thomas Tew didn't have any children of his own, but he came from a big family, a family that spanned the Atlantic. So Thomas Tew has great, 10 or 12 times great grandnieces and grandnephews living in places like Northamptonshire and Providence, Rhode Island, and all over the world. We humans are a notoriously mobile lot. Because Thomas Tew was a real pirate, with real family. However, he does serve as something of an excellent example of what makes the story of piracy so difficult and rewarding at the same time. Were we to stick to the hard facts as we know them, Thomas Tew's story would be short. Point A to point B to point C to point D, F. But because the facts, the hard facts of the story of Captain Thomas Tew are so remarkable, they've been embellished. First and most notably by Captain Charles Johnson. And those embellishments have become part of the narrative, part of the story of Thomas Tew. So deeply embedded in his myth that they've become almost unrecognizable from the facts. It's kind of like, well, did Alexander the Great actually pull his sword and cut through the Gordian knot? Or was that just a story told to us by his biographer, Arrian? When told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, did Leonidas say, "Then we will fight in the shade," or was that just an invention of Herodotus? When Thomas Tew asked his men if they wanted to sail off for a life of liberty and booty and rum and adventure and tropical paradises, did the crew really say to him, "A gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you"? I mean, maybe they did, or maybe not. But that is the story of Thomas Tew as we understand it. And that's the story, hard fact and myth intertwined, that I'm going to do my best to relate to you. This is episode 191, A Gold Chain or a Wooden Leg. The story of Thomas Tew, really the story of the pirates of the Round, can only begin in one place and with one topic. In West Africa, with slavery. Our common cultural conception of colonial Africa tends to come from later developments, mostly the post-industrial revolution 19th century partition of Africa, what they call the scramble for Africa. That's when huge swaths of African territory were gobbled up by the imperial European powers of the day. It was a fight for natural resources, resources intended to feed Europe's industrial engines. Literally, they were going for coal and petroleum. Prior to the scramble for Africa, though, African colonization was, well, I don't want to say it was smaller. I don't want to give the impression that it was a minor affair. Colonization was rampant, but the actual physical European holdings in West Africa were smaller than they later would be. There were numerous fortresses and port cities all along the coast of Africa belonging to the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch and the English. And we might talk a lot about King Sugar, as they called it, the economic driver of the day, mostly from the West Indies. But as much as in the 19th century Europe would strip Africa of coal and petroleum to fire their economic engines, in the 17th and 18th century they stripped Africa of generations of human beings to fire the economic engines of that time period. Sugar, tobacco, cotton a bit later on. And we know about the slave trade. It's one of the great evils of human history. But for our purposes, for our discussion today, those fortresses and port cities all along the coast of Africa were, especially in times of war, they were great military targets. First of all, they were targets of strategic importance. They made for good naval bases, places to collect wood and water. And then there's the plunder to be won. Gold and ivory, and of course the human beings to fuel the agricultural production of the New World. When that ancestor of mine sailed with Sir Walter Raleigh to raid the coast of Guinea, it was under a privateering commission, but they were commissioned to steal slaves from the Portuguese. That sort of thing was happening all the time. I bet you didn't think I was going to bring that back, did you? Don't worry, it's okay to be impressed with my narrative genius. I often am. But those raids, early on, those privateering raids were smash-and-grab operations to steal human beings and plunder from African outposts, to sail home with some of the most valuable cargo in the world. But they were the kind of job reserved for privateers. You can't have the honorable men of the Royal Navy dirtying their hands on business like that. But then there was a problem. It turned out that as much as the powers that be might want privateers to steal slaves from enemy powers, people just didn't like doing it. Which, yeah, I know, boo-hoo, the poor slave traders, right? But they were human beings, and watching a cargo hold full of other human beings starve to death isn't something most people can do. Hey, look, women and children, oh, that one's pregnant, oh, wait, they're all dead. Sailors in that position sometimes revolted. Not all the time, not even most of the time, but enough that it was causing an economic impact on the market. They couldn't necessarily be trusted to complete that kind of mission. So, the work was relegated to the Royal Africa Company in England, or their respective equal in other countries. By that point, it wasn't privateers doing this job. They couldn't be trusted to do so. But they were often brought on as hired guns for these missions. Additional ships paid a wage to offer additional firepower. But the pay wasn't great. Often it was atrocious. And the opportunity for plunder on such a highly regulated market was virtually nil. You can begin to see the problems that might arise from this sort of arrangement. All of which brings us to Thomas Tew. When we last caught up with Thomas Tew, he was fighting, probably, in the Battle of Port Royal during King William's War in the Canadian province of Acadia. We know that the privateer George Dew was there, with a privateering commission from the governor of Bermuda, and many assumed that Thomas Tew sailed either under or alongside him. If we accept that, we could assume that Thomas Tew also took part in the larger and disastrous Battle of Quebec. That was a battle that we skipped over in favor of talking about the witch trials in Salem. But England lost that battle, and they lost it bad. It's a bit of a shame that we skipped over that battle, though not really because it's important to our story, it's not. But the chronicle of that battle, the play-by-play record we have, was written by a man named Savage, and the passing up of that opportunity to use puns that bad just, well, it keeps me up at night. But I should note that while we've talked about a number of French victories in the war, essentially all of the conflict we've talked about has ended in French victory so far. But the League of Augsburg, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, England, they were having much better luck on land, on the continent. The war against Louis in the Rhineland was going well, even if it wasn't going well elsewhere. Still, though, for George Tew and probably Thomas Tew, the Battle of Quebec left them out a lot of resources. Shot and powder and money and probably men. And they had, after such a terrible defeat, almost nothing to show for it. Much later on, when the fallout from all of these so-called roundsmen reached back to their colonial leadership, when a number of prominent men were put on trial, a testimony came to light regarding Thomas Tew. Here in 1690, it was said to be well known that Thomas Tew sailed out of Newport as a freebooter. He was known to capture fishing vessels or small merchant craft off the coast of New England, but at one point, Thomas Tew was said to have captured a relatively rich prize off the coast of Cape Cod. Relatively compared to the substantial prizes he would take later on. All of this is questionable. It did appear in testimony under oath, but the corresponding records just aren't there. You'd think that maybe the court at Boston would mention it, but they didn't. If it did happen, this prize put a little coin in Thomas Tew's purse. Enough that in 1691, and this we know did happen, Thomas Tew sailed for Bermuda. He stayed there for several months. It looks like he may have been planning to settle down, to buy a house, that kind of thing. But while he was there in Bermuda, an investment opportunity presented itself. Now, we don't know the innermost thoughts and feelings of Thomas Tew in this time, but I suspect that he was hatching a scheme. I imagine Thomas Tew sharing drinks with his friends like George Tew and Richard Want. And you need to remember Richard Want. I imagine them sharing drinks at a local tavern and whispering to each other. Coming up with ideas, maybe recruiting and formulating their master plan. The recruiting is a big part of it. When you have a plan like I imagine Thomas Tew and Richard Want were currently building, you have to choose your crew and your friends carefully. The right sort of sailor, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We can say for certainty that Thomas Tew invested in a mission, a commission, really, to attack the French off the coast of Africa. It was a slaving mission. You see a lot of these around 1691. The governor of New York, Benjamin Fletcher, handed one to a privateer named William May on board the ship Blessed William, a ship with which May had definitely not just absconded from Nevis. In Port Royal, Jamaica, a Captain George Rain received a commission for his ship Loyal Jamaica, definitely not Bachelor's Delight, for a similar mission. They were all pirates. That was William Mason, who stole Captain Kidd's ship. George Rain was George Rayner from the Second Pacific Adventure, captain of the Bachelor's Delight. There were a ton of these handed out. Those pirates, men like George Rayner, William Mason, they all intended to engage in piracy. Not lawful privateering, but those Dutch and English sailors off the coast of Africa were less likely to arrest them with that privateering commission, that slip of paper that was their shield. I think that Thomas Tew was in the same boat. I don't think he intended to follow orders. But of course we don't know that. Maybe he did intend to follow orders. However, the crux of this entire mission, the entire investment really, came from a bunch of merchants who bought a sloop. Thomas Hill, Richard Gilbert, John Dickinson, Colonel Anthony White, and William Outerbridge, among a few others, some of whom were on the Governor's Council, they all pooled their money to buy a ship. They refit that ship and outfitted her and named her, in an ode to their newfound coalition and combined business venture, they named that ship Amity. A number of captains came forward to bid on the commission offered by the governor of Bermuda, Isaac Richier, but it was Thomas Tew that won that bidding war, and the captaincy of Amity. Now, Amity wasn't a big ship. She was a sloop. She had only 8 guns on board and could carry a crew of only 46 men. But all of those 46 were Thomas Tew's chosen crew. Captain George Dew had his own commission and a larger ship with more men, but they were to sail alongside Amity on the same mission. Both ships were to sail for Ile de Gorée, or Gorée Island. That was a French outpost at the mouth of the River Gambia in the modern nation of Senegal. En route, they were to meet with a small squadron of company ships, according to the commission, and by that they meant Royal Africa Company ships. They were to join up, and upon reaching Gorée, they would support those company ships in a raid to capture slaves and gold and ivory from the French. Upon their successful return to Bermuda, Thomas Tew and George Dew were to be paid a lump sum to be divided among the crew as they saw fit. This was the mission. Thomas Tew agreed to all of it. He signed papers about it. But he wasn't going to do any of it. A few days after leaving Bermuda, in the company of George Dew, the 2 ships were happened upon by a sudden and vicious storm. It might have been a hurricane. The time of year was right, at least. But in that storm, Amity and George Dew were separated. Captain Dew was hit particularly hard by the storm. His mainmast snapped in half. The best he could do was limp with his sails to the fore and aft. And unfortunately for Captain Dew and his crew, all of the nearby settlements were either local African settlements who would kill them all, or enemy Europeans who would kill them all. Their journey, George Dew's journey, was long and difficult. Weeks of searching, at first for the Amity and then for any kind of safe haven. That journey ended only when George Dew finally landed at the Dutch port at Saldanha Bay. The Dutch were, in his estimation, less likely to kill the English outright, and he was correct in that. They didn't kill them, but they did arrest George Dew and every member of his crew on suspicion of piracy. The Dutch impounded their ship and sent the crew off to Amsterdam to stand trial. And this was their own kind of legal piracy. The Dutch had no evidence against George Dew. He even had a privateering commission. George Dew and his men were eventually all acquitted, but despite his countersuit against the Netherlands, he never got his ship back. That stayed in the hands of the people at Saldanha Bay. Legal piracy. But Thomas Tew and Richard Want had much better luck. They were blown far off course by that storm, but Amity stayed in fine sailing shape throughout. But it was here, out at sea, all alone, dispersed by a storm, and with nothing to look forward to but a tough fight against the French and meager wages upon their return, that Thomas Tew gave his men a speech. We have several versions of this speech. Captain Charles Johnson gives us the first version submitted to the public in a general history of the pirates. Testimonies of the day would give additional and sometimes contradictory details of the speech. And then other authors, sometimes more reputable and sometimes less, would give their own versions of this speech in centuries to follow. But it's something of a commencement address for the golden age of piracy. I'm going to relate to you the version given to us by Don Carlos Saitz in Under the Black Flag. That's a history of pirates from 1925. And it's full of inaccuracies, but the version of Thomas Tew's speech given in that book seems to incorporate bits and pieces from all of those other sources. In that version, Thomas Tew gave his crew the following speech. He said, quote, that they were not ignorant of the design with which the governor fitted them out, the taking and destroying the French factory, that he, indeed, readily agreed to take a commission to this end, though contrary to his judgment, because it was being employed, but that he thought it would be a very injudicious expedition, which, did they succeed in, would be of no use to the public, and only advantage a private company of men, from whom they could expect no reward of their bravery, that he could see nothing but danger in the undertaking, without the least prospect of booty, that he could not suppose any man fond of fighting for fighting's sake, and few ventured their lives but with some view either of particular interest or public good. But here was not the least appearance of either. Wherefore he was of the opinion that they should turn their thoughts on what might better their circumstances, and if they were so inclined, he would undertake to shape a course which would lead them to ease and plenty, in which might pass the rest of their days, that one bold push would do their business, and they might return home not only without danger, but even with reparation. End quote. And it was then, at the end of this surprisingly erudite and eloquent speech, that the crew exclaimed with one voice, spontaneously they would have us believe, "A gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you." Which, no, that didn't happen. I would wager that Thomas Tew gave a speech much more like, "All right, lads, the coast is clear. Let's go get some treasure." And they would. Thomas Tew's early prizes would be some of the greatest yet taken in the entire history of piracy. They're going to rank, in the minds of the public at least, with the likes of Henry Morgan at Panama or Francis Drake at Nombre de Dios. They were big prizes, and they were especially big for prizes taken at sea. They're going to make Thomas Tew and Richard Want and the crew of Amity and a bunch of other people very rich, for a while at least. They're so big, though, that those prizes are going to inspire an entire generation of pirates and pirate hunters. From William Mason to Edward Coates to Henry Avery to William Kidd. If you'll allow me just a moment to talk about sailing craft, the names and definition of those craft. Today, a ship is any sufficiently large vessel capable of carrying cargo, specifically on the open ocean. That's why a riverboat, even a big one, is still called a boat. But in the age of sail, in the European definition, a ship had to be specifically ship-rigged. That's 3 masts at least with square-rigged sails, those big rectangular sails with limited maneuverability but a ton of power behind them. Those sails, that rigging, allowed for the multi-decked behemoths that ruled the waves during the age of sail. Most vessels that pirates sailed in weren't technically ships. Most of them weren't 3-masted and didn't have the square rigging. Brigantines, for example, or sloops were not technically ships. If the pirates had, say, a frigate or a bark, that was a ship. Queen Anne's Revenge was a ship. Bachelor's Delight was a ship. Amity, though, was not. A general rule of thumb, however, is that a ship can carry a boat, but a boat cannot carry a ship. That's the definition that I try and, admittedly, usually fail to stick to. But all of these definitions fall into complete disarray as soon as we leave the sphere of influence of Europe behind. When we get to Arabian vessels or Indian vessels or South Asian vessels, the rules are all different. For example, the Chinese ship called the Junk, which was a phenomenal ship despite its name. The junk had what were called fully battened sails. That's what gives them the ribbed look you see on so many Chinese vessels, which is a different style of sail than was used in the rest of the world. But we're not going to be talking about the Chinese junk for some time. It will eventually be the basis for the largest and most powerful, the most successful pirate armada of all time. But that's some 110 years in the future yet. For now, we're much more interested in Indian and Arabian shipping. Most of the ships native to the Indian Ocean were lateen-rigged. Those are the triangular sails you see on a lot of modern pleasure boats. The word lateen, as we've mentioned before, comes from the word Latin. There was a time when lateen-rigged vessels dominated the Mediterranean, carried Roman soldiers from one end of the empire to the other, hence Latin-rigged. There are a ton of examples we could use of fantastic lateen-rigged vessels. The sloop, for example, was lateen-rigged, a single-masted triangular sail, usually with a foresail and occasionally one at the aft. They were fast ships, extremely mobile ships, perfect for pirates. But I would rather talk about, for no reason whatsoever, I mean it's not like it's going to come up at any point today, I would rather talk about the dhow. Or maybe it should be dhow or dhow. Arabic gives me more trouble than French, and dhow derives from Arabic, so I apologize for that. But the dhow, as a sailing craft, was omnipresent in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, people from Arabia and India will argue about where the design of the dhow originated, but by 1690-1691, the dhow was everywhere. It could travel into the deep sea, but they were smaller craft, usually only 2-decked ships with a crew that maxed out somewhere around 50 or 60. But because they could only carry so much food and water, they were typically coastal vessels, coastal-ish vessels. A sloop, likewise, could travel anywhere, but you had to be a particularly crazy kind of sea dog to attempt a transcontinental voyage in such a small ship. This is episode 192, The Gate of Tears. Let us jump forward just a few years here. Benjamin Fletcher, the governor of New York, the former governor, was pulled before a London judge. And he had to be. A message had to be sent. Piracy was on the tip of every tongue. It was the talk of every town. It was the front page of every newspaper. And the pirates themselves, well, Henry Every was God knows where. William Kidd was indisposed at the time. Frederick Phillips, the church builder, landowner, and New York luminary who was integral to all of this, well, he was resting comfortably in his mansion in New York because people like Phillips don't get arrested. But he might have been a bit nervous. But everybody else, everybody that the authorities could get their hands on, was arrested and tried. But Adam Baldridge was the man in question, the man being questioned most forcefully, the star witness in this entire affair, what they call a smoking gun, a linchpin. See, there were a host of pirates and informants being questioned all around the world in the late 1690s. New York, Boston, London, some of those names we've met before. Many of those names we have not, but we will talk about all of them. Adam Baldridge, though, was the keystone, the eye of the storm. I don't have any more symbolic metaphors here, but you get the idea. He's the star witness. Baldridge, as we know, was the merchant proprietor of St. Mary's Island, the enabler, a facilitator, maybe, of an entire generation of pirates. And he talked. In 1698, Baldridge told the court at Westminster everything. Now, that might not be what we want a pirate mastermind to do. Our national snitching policy does read, after all, that snitches do get stitches, but there is no honor among thieves. That testimony, which is going to be something of a Bible for us moving forward, that testimony tells us about the first pirate that Baldridge will admit to having arrived at St. Mary's Island. The testimony reads, quote, October 13, 1691. Arrived Bachelor's Delight, Captain George Rayner, commander. Burden 180 tons or thereabouts, 14 guns, 70 or 80 men. That had made a voyage into the Red Sea and taken a ship belonging to the Moors. End quote. And then he gives a very detailed rundown of the goods traded. That was largely what he had to testify from his records, but I want to pause here. He says that Bachelor's Delight had taken a ship belonging to the Moors in the Red Sea. The Moors, the Moorish people, were an Islamic people from North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula, and generally the Western Mediterranean. But thanks to the Crusades and a few centuries of general cultural insensitivity, the Moors came to mean any people of Islamic faith. So Bachelor's Delight and George Rayner captured a Muslim ship, but we don't actually know who it belonged to. Certainly not the Moors. They weren't anywhere near Morocco or sailing out of Saleh, for example. What makes it difficult to pin down is that there were 3 large political entities within the Muslim world at the time. Not to mention all of the smaller states within those 3, but in the broadest possible strokes there were 3. First, there was the Ottoman Empire. Now, we don't need to reintroduce the Ottoman Empire. We know who they are. Asia Minor, North Africa, much of Eastern Europe, Greece, and parts of the Middle East were under their control. But there were 2 other large political and military entities within the Muslim world. The first was the Safavid Caliphate. We might just call them Persia. Many people do, even though it's not technically accurate. They controlled Iran and most of Iraq and large swaths of Central Eurasia. We'll get to them in a moment. First, I want to talk about the Mughal Empire. They are the entity with which we will be mostly concerned moving forward. The story of the Mughal Empire could begin with the Mongol Empire, with Genghis Khan himself, an empire that controlled most of Eurasia at one point, certainly all of what we would call today the Middle East. But I'm not going to delve into all of that. Instead, we're going to look at a man who was reportedly, supposedly, Genghis Khan's descendant, another steppe conqueror from the 1300s, Tamerlane. His right name should probably be Timur, but most of us in the West know him as Tamerlane. Tamerlane was one of the greatest military minds in all of history, one of the last to forge a large and powerful empire without the use of gunpowder. That empire in Central Eurasia did not stretch as far as the original Mongol Empire, but they did conquer Persia, such as the Persian Empire was in the 1300s. Eventually, though, Tamerlane moved on to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and a pretty big chunk of Turkey fell under their sway. This was not only the Persian Empire, but also much of the Ottoman Empire. One could argue that some of the pressure put on the Ottomans by Tamerlane from the east forced the Ottomans to move west, to expand into the Ottoman Empire. That all lasted until about the mid-1500s, when what they called the Timurid Empire had grown weak and fat, as empires tend to do. A resurgent Shia peoples, a resurgent Persian people, started taking back their land, mostly in Iran to start. That was the beginning of the Safavid Caliphate. Now, we're not going to be super concerned with the Safavid moving forward. Their naval presence on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea wasn't huge. But when it became clear that the Safavid were ascendant, that they were going to win back Iran and perhaps the whole of the Timurid Empire, a leader among the Timurid named Babur dug in his heels at Kabul. He held out there against all odds. And when the enemy began to fall back, Babur moved out. He took back territory in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Finally, after years of fighting, after years of defeating the Safavids, he secured an alliance with the Safavid Empire. A peace treaty that led to a military alliance and agreed-upon borders. And with his borders to the east now secure, Babur began to expand. First to the north, to Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, but he ran into a new military force out of Kievan Rus. We would call them Russia. So Babur turned around and began to move south. Now, traditional military thinking would say that there was nowhere to move south. His borders ended at the Himalaya Mountains. But his forces, along with a large number of troops from both the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire, they were all allied now, those troops pushed through the Himalayas and into Hindu India. This was one of the great military moves in all of history. It's Hannibal crossing the Alps, only with way more troops and guns and bigger mountains. What makes it especially noteworthy is that Babur himself was a descendant of Timur the Great, of Tamerlane, and thus he was a descendant of Genghis Khan. It's a lineage he played up, as he should, being related to two of the greatest military minds in history. But neither the Mongol Empire under the Great Khan nor the Timurid Empire under Timur, neither ever breached the Himalayas. It was just too much trouble. Leave India to Indian devices. But here, in the 1500s, Babur did exactly that. According to his own propagandists, this new Mughal Empire was a Mongol Empire. Of course, the conquest of India wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. Despite a string of victories all throughout his life, Babur was going to die long before the conquest of India was complete. And honestly, the conquest of India was never really completed, not wholly. The whole of India never belonged entirely to the Mughal Empire. When the various kings and rajas around India began to realize that this Muslim horde coming through the Himalayas was going to be a real problem, they began to allow Europeans to build fortresses and factories all along their coast. Portuguese at first, then Dutch, but in 1611, the English East India Company built a factory at Masulipatam. A few years later, in 1640, they were granted license to build another factory at Madras in the Bay of Bengal. And when Charles II married a Portuguese princess, Catherine, he was granted the island of Bombay. And those three settlements, for a while at least, were it for England in India. The first English fort built in India, Fort St. Charles, was built in Madras in 1640, the same year they were granted license to settle. That fortress was the focal point of the First Anglo-Mughal War. Now, that war would not take place until the 1680s, but it was important. English forces fighting Mughal forces on the side, more or less, of the Rajas. But that's the whole point here. That's why the Indians gave territory to the Europeans. Sure, here's a bit of coastline so you can trade in spices, but in return for that privilege, you have to fight the Mughal. And the Mughal Empire was pushing ever further south. Aside from these few European holdouts on the coast, most of India was under their control. Only the tip of India still belonged, politically, to Indians. I bring all that up because, we needed to rip the Band-Aid off at some point to really understand who and what the Mughal were, but more to illustrate that we don't know who that Moorish ship that Bachelor's Delight captured belonged to. Were they Mughal or Ottoman or maybe even Safavid? The English were not specific. And it does matter. The English were kind of at war with the Ottoman Empire. Not open declared warfare, but the Ottomans were putting pressure on Austria. And Austria were members of the League of Augsburg that bound the Netherlands and England and Spain and Austria all together. If George Rayner, an English pirate, was capturing Ottoman shipping, No big deal, buddy, go for it. They are, after all, the enemy. But if he was capturing Mughal shipping, well, the treaty between Mughal India and England after the First Mughal War was less than a year old. It was a delicate peace at best. If he was capturing those ships, well, that might cause diplomatic tensions. Nonetheless, when William III came to the throne, it was felt that fresh blood was needed in India. In part, this was to secure William III on the throne. You don't want Jacobite loyalists holding India as a sort of a kingdom in exile, after all, but also new eyes and new hands to deal with the problem of the Mughal Empire. One of those was a bright young man named Nathaniel Higginson, who was sent in 1689 to serve as mayor of Madras. Nathaniel Higginson was the son of an American minister, a minister out of Salem, in fact. His father, John Higginson, did not take part in the Salem witch trials. He was there, he was a minister in Salem after all, but he objected to the whole affair. But Nathaniel's first job as mayor of Madras here near the end of the First Anglo-Mughal War was to rebuild the dilapidated Fort Charles. And to that end, Nathaniel Higginson employed his younger brother, Thomas. Thomas Higginson was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, kind of a roving, wild spirit, a young man who wanted ease and adventure and a good wage, a man who wanted freedom. And where might a wild young man find all of that? In the Indian Ocean in 1689. Now, we don't have the letter that Nathaniel Higginson sent to his father. It was very likely lost in the riots that destroyed so much of the record of the Salem witch trials during the American Revolution. But we do have Reverend John Higginson's letter back to his son. By that point, he was already deeply concerned with the witch fever that was beginning to grip his community, but far more concerned was the Reverend, at least in this letter, about his youngest son, Thomas. He urged Nathaniel to set aside some money, quote, for Thomas, if he return from Arabia, whither he has gone with privateers contrary to my own mind and his own promise. End quote. Thomas Higginson, youngest son of a Salem minister and brother to the mayor of Madras itself, had apparently gone off to rove with privateers. And that's a key point here. According to East India Company statute agreed to by the king, there could technically be no privateers beyond the Cape of Good Hope. Even licensed privateer vessels, ships licensed to operate elsewhere, would be considered outlaws in East India Company waters. When Reverend Higginson talks about the privateers with which his youngest son is sailing, he's talking about pirates. Thomas Higginson had signed up with a pirate crew. Now, we don't know who that crew was, but we can make a pretty good guess here. The pirate ship Signet, John Reed captain, was in the area at the time. They put in at Dutch ports nearby, very nearby, some of them close enough that an enterprising Englishman could have made his way there. It's very possible that Thomas Higginson was there when Signet and Bachelor's Delight met at the Bay of St. Augustine. When Bachelor's Delight returned to the region some months later, we can presume that Higginson could still have been there. It's likely that he even joined up with George Rayner's crew, since Signet was currently sinking to the bottom of St. Augustine Bay. This is all a question of wind currents. Coming around the Cape, the wind is pushing east. A ship doing so could easily make for the southwest corner of Madagascar, but making it all the way up to St. Mary's Island in the northeast would be a harder sell, a harder sail, not impossible, but difficult. And after rounding the Cape of Good Hope, a ship is going to need a place to collect wood and water. It's a difficult crossing. Maybe, if they had nowhere else to buy such supplies, food and shot and powder and men, From the moment that Signet anchored in the Bay of St. Augustine and it began to sink, any passing pirate ship could be assured of supplies there, and men. But from the Bay of St. Augustine, in the Indian Ocean, the wind follows, most of the year at least, a counterclockwise pattern. From Madagascar, a ship would be pushed east to Australia and Indonesia, and then north to the coasts of Southeast Asia, and finally into the Bay of Bengal, at which point in the northern Indian Ocean the wind turns west, carrying you back along the southern coast of Asia and finally toward Arabia and the Red Sea. Then the wind is going to begin to push you back to the south, toward Madagascar and St. Mary's, where Adam Baldridge was waiting to buy all of your goods at cut-rate prices. That is the pirate round. That is the route that George Rayner and Bachelor's Delight most likely took before arriving at St. Mary's on 13 October 1691 with holds full of Moorish goods. It was the route that a number of ships had already taken, and the route that more than a few will take in the future. It was the route that, here on the 13th of October 1691, Captain Thomas Tew and the Amity were well on their way to beginning. Thomas Tew is often given credit for starting the pirate round, but he didn't really. It's more like, it's like Elvis popularizing a classic R&B song. You know, Elvis didn't write Hound Dog. Big Mama Thornton recorded it first, but we all know Elvis's version. It's the famous version, and Elvis made a huge pile of money because of it. As will Thomas Tew. After that storm that separated Thomas Tew and George Dew, after the speech that Thomas Tew gave after the storm, after his crew agreed a gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you, after everyone on board agreed to go pirate, the crew officially voted in Thomas Tew as captain of Amity. Then they voted in Richard Want as their quartermaster and representative. That's the point at which we lose track of Amity for a while. I suspect they stopped off at St. Augustine Bay. Adam Baldridge up at St. Mary's doesn't mention Thomas Tew, not yet, not at this point. And they would have needed to resupply the food and the water and a good bit of both. They had a voyage ahead of them. They also gathered crew, and I suspect they did so here at St. Augustine Bay from the leftovers of Signet. We do know that back in Bermuda, Amity carried 46 men. Later on in this story, they're going to have 60 with them. They could have picked up sailors in any number of ports later on, but St. Augustine was, or at least later on, would come to be known as Libertalia. The myths about Libertalia range far beyond factual history. But right here, right now, when Thomas Tew and Amity showed up at St. Augustine Bay, there were pirates there who had sailed with John Cook and Edward Davis. 7 years earlier, they'd sailed on Lima in Peru. They'd crossed the Pacific with Charles Swan and William Dampier. They'd spent those tumultuous weeks and months on Mindanao in the Philippines, and finally, after a voyage around the Indian Ocean, they were here, a decade after having left home. I say after having left home, but really, these pirates did not have homes. It's not like they had a house somewhere waiting for them with family and a hearth and a warm bed. These pirates were nomads. Until, that is, they stopped here, at St. Augustine Bay, at what would be called Libertalia. And I'm using that term, but if we accept Libertalia as a concept at the very least, we need to understand that it isn't that yet. It's not a thriving pirate colony. We're talking about a broken-down old ship, the Signet, sinking into the bay. A few dozen pirates, probably still led by John Reed. We're talking huts just beyond the tree line, rusty muskets, and a startlingly diminishing cache of rum. This was not a glamorous life, but I don't want you to picture Swiss Family Robinson either. This was not a marooned crew on the shores of Madagascar. They chose to stop here. The pirates of the Signet were stationed at a pristine anchorage on one of the most traveled sea routes in the whole world. A lot of ships would be sailing by, and if they were not welcome at the Dutch ports in South Africa or the French ports around the region, this might be the best place for them to stop. Ships, for example, like Amity. From the time that Thomas Tew accepted his privateering commission on Bermuda in the summer of 1692, to when he and Richard Want and the whole crew turned pirate, to rounding Cape Horn and probably visiting St. Augustine Bay, that was a voyage of months. From Libertalia, or what would become Libertalia, Amity would have followed the wind around the whole of the pirate round. And that's a voyage about which we know almost nothing. No one kept a journal on this voyage, not one that has come down to us at least. But beyond that, the pirates made no waves on that voyage whatsoever. There are no reports that I've found of a suspicious ship lurking about, no vessels happened upon in Indonesia by a bunch of English rovers. Not even in the factories belonging to the Dutch or English East India companies. There are no mentions of Thomas Tew, but months will pass. Assuming that they did take this voyage around the round, the wind would have carried them eventually to India and back east toward the Arabian Peninsula. In total, from Bermuda to Arabia so far, Amity had been at sea for more than a year, and I imagine that it was a voyage filled with adventure and hardship, with fantastical locales that make for amazing stories, but we don't know those stories. What we do know is that in late September or early October 1693, Amity approached a strait, the strait that separates Africa from Arabia, the entrance to the Red Sea called Bab el-Mandeb. In English, the Gate of Tears. The Gate of Tears, Bab el-Mandeb, is the hottest spot on the whole of the pirate round. The Gate of Tears is only about 20 miles wide, or 30 kilometers, or 5.8 nautical leagues. But all of the shipping that's going in or out of the Red Sea has to pass through the Gate of Tears. Now, it's not called the Gate of Tears because of pirates, as much as I would love to claim that to be the case. That's an ancient name, dating back to prehistory. But it is apt because of what the pirates are going to do. Over the next several years, the pirates are going to terrorize the Gate of Tears. In fact, they already had. And it was here, hiding in a cove on the coast of Africa, that Amity and Thomas Tew and Richard Want spotted a fleet of 6 vessels sailing into the Gate of Tears, north into the Red Sea. As I said earlier, the Tew is a fantastic ship. It's light and maneuverable, and it's fast. A small fleet of the Tew, say 6 or so, could carry as much shipping as a large European cargo vessel, and the investment in timber and construction materials was comparable, even less sometimes. But there was one big problem with the Tew. They couldn't carry many guns, or at least they didn't carry many guns. Big cannon take up a lot of space and weight on a ship, space and weight that could be better allocated to cargo. And at this point in time, 1693, these were safe and friendly waters. There's no reason to put guns on a ship that could be carrying trade goods. Now, if you were at war, space would be allocated for guns, and there would be gunboats accompanying a fleet like this, probably carracks, the ships that gave rise to the Age of Sail that could carry a ton of guns. If this were a time of war. But it wasn't. Well, it was. The 9 Years' War was going on, but it was not a time of war for Mughal India. The Mughal emperor at the time, the Padishah, what the English call the Grand Mughal, was a man named Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb was a shrewd leader of the empire. He expanded the empire to its largest extent ever. Under his rule, the Mughal Empire would grow to become the largest in the world in terms of population and in economic power. But Aurangzeb was not one to waste money. Why, for example, should he send a fleet of dhow out to the Red Sea with gunboats in tow? That was an extra expense. And the fleet that Thomas Tew spotted there at the entrance to the Red Sea at the Gate of Tears belonged to the Padishah, to Aurangzeb. Now that's not out of the ordinary. It wasn't some kind of grand imperial fleet here. Nearly all fleets out of the Mughal Empire belonged to the royal family, either Aurangzeb himself or his mother or one of his wives. India did not have an East India Company. The imperial family sort of served that purpose. And this fleet belonging to the emperor was on a voyage of trade to the Ottoman Empire, carrying rich Indian goods destined for ports on the Red Sea. The flagship out front, a large version of the dhow, carried 300 men, all of them carrying firearms, 300 men versus the 60 on board Amity. Plus, there were 5 other ships in the fleet, smaller, yeah, but carrying comparable numbers of people, all of them with firearms of their own. This should have been no contest, right? And it wasn't a contest. Amity, spotting the Mughal fleet sailing into the Gate of Tears, surprised them. She sailed south to meet the flagship and opened a fulisade, a full broadside. That's not much on a sloop of 8 guns. That's 4 cannon opening fire on the Mughal flagship, maybe 2 volleys. But those cannon had range. Without big guns to reply to that volley, the Mughal flagship had to surrender. They raised the white flag. Now, Amity almost certainly did not send over a force to occupy the Mughal flagship. They still had 300 men on board. Amity's strength was not in her pirates, but her guns. Instead, the flagship put boats into the water and abandoned her for the other ships in the fleet. It was there, with all of the Mughal's men safely aboard other vessels, that Amity sent over a skeleton crew to take the ship. In all, the fighting had taken less than half a day, and not a single pirate was killed, or even injured, in the capture of this Mughal vessel. Adam Baldridge would say in that later testimony, quote, "Arrived the ship Amity, Captain Thomas Tew commander, burdened 70 tons, 8 guns, 60 men, having taken a ship in the Red Seas that did belong to the Moors. As the men did report, they took as much money in her as made the whole share run £1,200 a man. They careened at St. Mary's and had some cattle from me, but for their victualling and sea store, they bought from the Negroes. I sold Captain Tew and his company some goods brought in the Charles from New York. Captain Tew set sail from St. Mary's December 23rd, 1693, bound for America." End quote. Amity careened at St. Mary's. They bought cattle from Adam Baldridge and then, after a couple of months, set off from St. Mary's to St. Augustine, presumably to drop off a bunch of pirates who wanted to stay. At least, when Amity arrived back in America, the crew was again somewhere around 40, which, for those crewmen, makes sense. I mean, if you had the food and the rum and a gun and a partner, a lot of the pirates were probably in relationships with other pirates, and for the rest, the women of Madagascar were quite inviting. But if you had all of that with, no house, no responsibilities, just everything you needed to relax and enjoy yourself until another ship arrived, wouldn't you consider staying at one of the most beautiful places on the whole of planet Earth? If you had not had a home for 10 whole years, why not make one here? As for the Amity, Thomas Tew and Richard Want and the other 40 or so members of the crew each had £1,200 sterling. That is quite a haul. They probably passed first to the West Indies, maybe to Nassau, before heading on north. Now, we do know that they did not stop at Bermuda. Questions would have been asked when they arrived at Bermuda. After all, they'd never made rendezvous with that squadron intended to attack the French, as had been their mission. Those investors, the owners of Amity, would have expected them to return the ship and to repay their investment, neither of which the crew, nor Richard Want, nor Thomas Tew intended to do. Instead, Amity sailed for Newport, Rhode Island, Thomas Tew's home, and from there on to New York. There are those who would tell you that Thomas Tew was the first real pirate of the golden age of piracy, and I see where they'd be coming from there. There is something to that statement, but it's still not quite right. Within the parameters of what would make Tew the first pirate of the golden age, I would argue for someone like John Hamlin of the pirate ship Trickster. He was one of the last of the buccaneers, that's true, but he was also one of the first pirates to sail from America to Africa, where he would spend a good couple of years pirating everything he could get his hands on. Thomas Tew and the pirate ship Amity were the first proper pirates of the Golden Age to capture a really amazingly rich prize out of the Mughal Empire. Among the first pirates to hit a Mughal ship, and that changed the game. To pick up my metaphor from last time, that's Elvis on Ed Sullivan. And a flood of pirates are going to follow in the wake of Thomas Tew and Amity. That's going to set off the first explosion of the golden age of piracy. But before we get there, I do want to take a day to look at the pirates and privateers and unlicensed naval contractors who were operating at the same time as Amity. Sea rovers who would make an impact but never be quite as rich or as famous as Thomas Tew. Well, at least not most of them. This is episode 193, Interlopers. According to the English Royal Africa Company, the RAC, an interloper was anybody engaging in the slave trade, in English markets at least, without a license from the Crown. Since only the RAC got those licenses from the Crown, an interloper was anyone who was slaving that was not a member of the company. And there were two types of slaving vessels and slaving missions engaged in by the RAC. First were what we, at least I, usually think of when we imagine the slave trade. Those large vessels who made stops at their factories all along the coast of West Africa. And of course we're all aware that a factory in 1700 was not a factory, not a manufacturing plant, and certainly not industrialized, more an armed and defended fortress warehouse intended for international trade. We're talking huge estates with manor houses and barracks within their grounds, and, of course, actual warehouses where food and spices and dyes and precious metals and living human beings were stored for their voyage on the triangle trade to America and then on to Europe. Those were the hub of slave shipping. But of course, those factories did engage in slaving expeditions, actually going out into the interior of Africa to capture slaves. But that was, most often those kind of expeditions looked kind of like a safari, big game hunting and logging, literally gathering ebony and ivory. Most of the actual capturing of slaves appears to have been done by other Africans. They were captured through warfare and imperial expansion. It's a method that's always been used to capture slaves, from Greece to Rome to Mesoamerica. In recent years, there have been some good questions raised as to the truth and validity of that claim. That there was propaganda and historical revisionism used to somehow lessen the guilt of European slavers. And yeah, it's not a universal truth. The methods did vary depending on time and place. Some of that is certainly 19th century propaganda. And while those questions have raised a lot of good points about the accepted history of the era, the pendulum has begun to swing back toward the middle. This kind of thing did happen, kind of a lot. But that doesn't lessen anybody's guilt in this whole affair. You don't get to say, but officer, I only bought the drugs and then, sold them at a higher price. That doesn't make you any more innocent. It makes you a drug dealer. That's the first kind of mission engaged in by the Royal Africa Company. The second was perhaps even more common but smaller in scale. The company would issue what amounted to almost privateering commissions, private contractors who were to scout out potential new markets for the Royal Africa Company. Now, all of this was highly regulated by the company. Those privateers, for the lack of a better word, those ships were to make contact with people on the coast, to initiate trade, and then, once a good trade relationship had been established, they could begin to talk about maybe procuring a few slaves, if you happen to know where to find any, of course. This was the basis for how new factories were to be established. And it took time. You didn't always want to build a factory everywhere you landed, necessarily. It took years of careful diplomacy to make that decision. Small ships building trust with the locals, procuring guides and translators. You don't just jump right into capturing slaves with people you just met. It takes a bit of finesse. One such agent of the RAC, captain of the ship Hannibal, Thomas Phillips, made these kind of careful expeditions to the African coast on a regular basis. He spent years of his life and career doing just that, which makes it noteworthy when Phillips wrote in his ship's log in 1693, quote, "I have nowhere upon the coast met Negroes so shy as here, which makes me fancy they have had tricks played on them by such blades as Long Ben, alias Every, who have seized them and carried them away." End quote. Henry Every, Long Ben, was active on the coast of Africa in 1692 and into 1693. This is the first mention we have of Henry Every in the record since he left Royal Naval Service after the Battle of Beachy Head, and it appears that he was acting as an interloper. Now, this particular passage doesn't give us any real details on Every's actual activity on the coast of Africa. Captain Phillips tells us that tricks were played by such blades as Long Ben. It suggests to me that Every was probably the most notorious interloper active at the time, the reference point for all of the others active on the coast of Africa. And as an interloper, Every and the others were breaking more rules than just trading in human lives outside the law. They were upsetting that diplomatic balance that the RAC relied upon. It was a serious infraction and hurt their business. When Captain Thomas complains about the shyness of the locals, he's talking about the people with whom he and others like him had been building those relationships for some time now. Not slaves, but merchants. And Henry Every would sail in, flying the cross of St. George, that red cross on a white background, the national flag of England, prior to unionization. In naval circles, it was called the King's Jack, and it was a flag that those locals would have recognized as friendly. Then, this gives me an opportunity to read from one of my favorite books about pirates, the book that got me interested in real piracy. The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard. Woodard writes, quote, "Avery's later admirers made much of his upstanding behavior toward English and European captives, but they also tended to skip over or make light of his treatment of non-white foreigners who fell into his clutches. His crew and captives would later describe many acts of cruelty. Once, on the coast of Africa, Avery lured a band of local tribesmen aboard with the promise of trade. Then he stole their gold, clapped them into irons, and sold at least 7 of them into slavery." End quote. Now that's a tidbit that we know about thanks to the records of a colonial administrator named Cadwallader Jones. Jones was the governor of a small, poor, but growing colony in the West Indies. In 1689, following the Glorious Revolution, Jones had sailed for the Bahamas with a new charter for those islands. It was Jones that rechristened the colonial capital of the Bahamas, Charlestown, after the new King William. It was to be called Nassau. Now, Nassau was always a haven for pirates and privateers. We've passed through it time and time again with the likes of Jan Willems and Thomas Paine, and, of course, the current governor of Massachusetts, William Phips. But on 7 June 1692, an earthquake hit the island of Jamaica, and it was a bad one. The capital of Jamaica, Port Royal, was the largest English trading hub in the West Indies, one of the largest cities in the Caribbean, and it was a notorious hive of scum and villainy, home to many a scallywag, and in 1692, in that earthquake, it was destroyed. It fell into the ocean. They'd still today pull up finds from the sea floor from time to time. The earthquake itself and the subsequent tsunami and then the homelessness and lack of food and proper medical care, all in all left more than 5,000 people dead. But all of those pirates and privateers who called Port Royal a base were suddenly out of a home. In years past, they would have likely sailed for Tortuga, but England and France were currently at war in 1692. In days past, they probably would have sailed for Tortuga, but in 1692, England and France were at war. La Roue de Graaf would have killed them. So instead, they sailed for what had been, prior to this time, something of a quiet hideout, a place to relax, to drink rum, to maybe hunt some ambergris, but more than anything else to let the heat die down. Nassau you could describe as kind of a vacation home for the buccaneers. But within a few weeks of the destruction of Port Royal, the port at Nassau, in the heart of the Bahamas, was filled with pirate ships. The coast was suddenly littered with tents and then with shacks, and finally, fully fledged buildings started going up. Establishments that offered rum and women and gaming went up quickly. The locals from Nassau and the survivors from Port Royal wanted to get their cut of whatever the pirates were going to bring in. The governor of Nassau, Cadwallader Jones, was powerless to stop any of this, and I doubt that he wanted to stop any of it. England was at war with France, but it's not like the Royal Navy was going to send a squadron in to defend Nassau. But now, through sheer luck, an earthquake was the cause. Now, he had an armada of well-armed pirate ships in the harbor. Instead of trying to kick all of those pirates out, Cadwallader Jones welcomed them in with open arms, if, that is, they were willing to do business with him. Jones set himself up as kind of a pirate liaison. On the one hand, he was a fence, buying and selling illicit goods for resale, but on the other, he was a colonial administrator. He was a royally appointed governor, and he had contacts that could give the pirates jobs. Among these contacts was a doctor in Charleston in the Carolina colony, but we'll talk about him next time. The other primary contact was a rich and powerful merchant out of New York, Frederick Phillips, and with Frederick Phillips comes Adam Baldridge. This right here is the golden age of piracy taking shape. Thanks to the Jamaican earthquake of 1692 and the subsequent collapse of long-established slave markets there, a bunch of players were suddenly trying to get into the game. There was this worldwide criminal conspiracy from New York to Nassau to Madagascar that was built to corner the global slave market. Henry Every, we know, was among those pirates and interlopers who ran a kind of alternate triangle trade. Henry Every and those in his line of work would get a commission from Governor Jones in Nassau. From there, they would sail up to New York or Charleston and take on a shipload of guns and foodstuffs and booze. Lots of booze. And then they would sail on to Africa and finally St. Mary's Island. They'd sell the cargo that they had been commissioned to carry to Africa in America, as well as any that they might have of their own. And then they would pick up slaves. either by capturing them themselves or buying them from one of their bases in Africa. Finally, they would take those slaves back to Nassau and to Charleston, where they would be sold at market. This is an alternate definition of the pirate round, as opposed to the Indian Ocean round, which we discussed last time, but I don't like this definition as much. It has to do less with piracy and more with men like Cadwallader Jones and Frederick Phillips. It's less a pirate round and more of a slaver's round, kind of a precursor to the pirate round. If we were to go back just a few years to before the Glorious Revolution and Governor Cadwallader Jones, to 1685, we would meet a trio of pirates operating originally out of New England. In 1685, Captain Thomas Henry, with his shipmates Thomas Woolery and Christopher Geff, arrived at Bermuda with a captured Dutch prize in tow. You may recall that prior to 1686, when Bermuda became a crown colony, the island was much less permissible toward this kind of thing. Captain Henry, upon going ashore to sell this prize, was arrested. Thomas Woolery and Christopher Geff only just escaped capture themselves. But from Bermuda, those two took that same route that Thomas Tew would take a few years later. They sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to Madagascar and finally into the Red Sea. There they captured a few smaller prizes, mostly Arab shipping, and sailed it back across the Atlantic with holds full of loot. However, their options for a place to land and fence their goods were limited. Bermuda was out. In fact, most of the West Indies were cracking down on piracy. So in 1687, Thomas Woolery and Christopher Geff arrived at New Providence Island, aboard a large and quite rich pirate vessel. This was before Cadwallader Jones arrived in the Bahamas with such progressive ideas on piracy. The local magistrate at the time would write, quote, "It was the king's order that the pirates should not be entertained. As she continued standing in," he means the pirate ship staying in port, "I fired a shot across her forefoot. She then anchored, and next day Woolery told me that he was come to wood and water, that he had a commission and had done nothing contrary to it, and that he had taken in Geff and his companions in extremity of distress. I refused him leave to come in, and he sailed away next day. I am told that they burnt the ship at Andrews Island and disappeared, leaving only 6 or 7 men in the Bahamas." End quote. Now that is a good story. Turning away the pirates, firing across the bow, but no one believed that story. Everyone from Bermuda to Boston suspected that the pirates were still harbored there at New Providence Island. The lieutenant governor of Jamaica, Hinder Molesworth, who you may remember as one of Morgan's adversaries, Molesworth had first-hand knowledge of Geff and Woolery still active in the Bahamas. It's likely that he received this first-hand information from the pirate-turned-pirate hunter, John Coxon. You might remember him as well. So Molesworth sent out HMS Drake to capture Geff and Woolery. And the Drake reportedly, quote, quarreled and burnt the pirate ship, but some of them had bought a vessel and intended to sail for New England, but were detained by want of provisions. Some of these pirates have so much money they pay half a crown for a pound of flour. End quote. But that is yet another good story, that the pirates were detained, or perhaps even that this battle took place. We know that Thomas Woolery and Christopher Geff were going to get away with most of their men and cargo intact, and they were going to make it to Boston, where they would sell that cargo. Geff and Woolery aren't the point here. They're merely an illustration that piracy was alive and well at New Providence before Cadwallader Jones and Henry Every. But by that point, by the time Cadwallader Jones was in office and all of the Port Royal pirates had made their way to Nassau, business was booming. And with that in mind, I would like to end today with a discussion of the pirate John Churcher. His right name should probably be John Thurber, but Adam Baldridge records his name as John Churcher, so we'll go with that. John Churcher was small time in terms of piracy. He wasn't a big name. He ran afoul of John Coxon. Once Coxon was a pirate hunter, but that's really the only record we have of his West Indian affairs prior to 1692. There is a story about John Churcher in Carolina, in Charleston, but that involves the doctor that I briefly mentioned earlier and that we will talk about next time. But John Churcher made numerous voyages to Madagascar. He may have been in league at one point with John Hamlin and the Trickster. At least, they are known to have been lurking around Africa at around the same time. His familiarity with the Cape of Good Hope, Madagascar, the whole region really, made John Churcher a perfect candidate when Cadswell Jones and Adam Baldridge and Frederick Phillips set up their operation. Our first record comes from Nassau, circa 1692, when John Churcher took in wood and water there. Now, Cadswell Jones didn't record anything in his journal along the lines of, "Today I instructed Captain Churcher to sail for New York, where Frederick Phillips will set him on an illegal slaving mission," but that's not the kind of thing you write down. Still, though, that's what Cadswell Jones did. Because Captain Churcher was about to sail for New York, where Frederick Phillips would set him on an illegal slaving mission. Frederick Phillips, though, was almost certainly not at that meeting. People like him did not go to meetings with people like John Churcher. They've got guys for that. Guys that work for guys, that work for guys. He was levels removed from this kind of interaction, but Frederick Phillips did put up his own ship for this operation. One of his ships, he had a bunch of them. But he put up the Charles, a 200-ton, 10-gun brigantine that carried 30 men. I'll let Adam Baldridge pick up the story here, but take note of what he finds important. Baldridge would testify later on, quote, August 7th, 1693, arrived the ship Charles, John Churcher master, from New York. Mr. Fred Phillips, owner, sent to bring me several sorts of goods. She had 2 cargoes in her, one consigned to said master to dispose of, and one to me, continuing as followeth. 44 pair of shoes and pumps, 6 dozen of worsted and threaded stockings, 3 dozen of speckled shirts and breeches, 12 hats, some carpenter's tools, 5 barrels of rum, 4 quarter casks of Madeira wine, 10 cases of spirits, 2 old stills full of holes, 1 worm, 2 grindstones, 2 cross saws, and 1 whip saw, 3 jars of oil, 2 small iron pots, 3 barrels of cannon and powder, some books, catechisms, primers, and horn books, 2 Bibles, and some garden seeds, 3 dozen of hoes, and I returned for the said goods 1,100 pieces of 8 and dollars, 34 slaves, 15 head of cattle, 57 bars of iron. October the 5th, he set sail from St. Mary's, after having sold part of his cargo to the white men upon Madagascar, to Mauritania to take in slaves. End quote. Now, there's a couple of things to note here. First, you'll notice that John Churcher arrived at St. Mary's after George Rayner and Bachelor's Delight, but before Thomas Tew and Amity. He's the second article in Baldridge's testimony. But more important is that, well, that's a laundry list of cargo. That's a lot of stuff. We have that list thanks to Baldridge's excellent records. He was a businessman, after all. But it can tell us quite a bit about what was going on at the time. There were carpenter's tools and grindstones and saws, just the kind of stuff that you would need if you were, building a large wooden structure of some kind. If, for example, that large wooden structure were a fort, all of that cannon and powder would be a necessity. If it was less a fortress and more a home, for Adam Baldridge, well, look what else he was getting delivered. Clothes, and lots of clothes, far more clothing than he would personally need, 44 pairs of shoes. And then there were seeds for planting, a necessity if you intended to live somewhere for some extended period of time, but most interesting to me, and this might be my own proclivity as a bibliophile, are the books. Kind of a lot of books for a remote pirate haven, right? And mostly they were religious books, but also a bunch of educational texts. Primers and horn books were educational books intended for children. They taught reading, writing, arithmetic, that kind of thing. But that is exactly what one would need to build a home. Seeds, clothing, and books. It's also what one would need to build a family, if one were so inclined. Adam Baldridge was building a fortress there on St. Mary's, and the fortress is something that everyone who would visit in the years to come would make special note of. It was impressive. It was a huge wooden palisade just inside the tree line that contained a wall of cannon overlooking the harbor there. And there was a scaffolding on the inside climbing the walls to reach all of those gun ports. To hear the pirates tell it, it was a feat of engineering. But what the pirates that would visit St. Mary's were more interested in was the house. Not the feat of engineering. It was pretty big, but nothing compared to what you could find even in a place like Nassau. Instead, they were more interested in what the house contained. There was food and drink, all of those casks of Madeira wine and spirits. But most interesting to the pirates after months at sea was the women. Adam Baldridge's house was home to lots of women. Most of them Madagascar locals. Now, I'm really unsure if I should call them natives of Madagascar here. They'd been there for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years by this point. But the people of Madagascar did originally come from Indonesia. Ethnologically and linguistically, they're considered Afro-Indonesian peoples. Regardless, though, Adam Baldridge hosted dozens of beautiful young Madagascar women at his home, inside his pirate fortress. In 1693, it was not yet the case, but before long, Adam Baldridge was going to have a whole mess of kids running around his fortress. I can't help but think that all of those Bibles and catechisms and educational primers must have been for those children. And there's eventually going to be so many kids running around Madagascar, both here at St. Mary's and at St. Augustine Bay later on, that the genetic footprint of the pirates is still present on Madagascar today. Because this wasn't all Adam Baldridge. I mean, he was certainly doing his part here, but he's not Genghis Khan. He had a lot of help in fathering all of these children. The pirates that would come to St. Mary's to sell their cargo also enjoyed the island for a taste of home. A comfortable bed to sleep in, a hot, fresh meal, and the companionship offered there. This is what St. Mary's was not yet, but what it was about to become. And all of that would start to take shape with the arrival of John Churcher and the Charles. All of those supplies would help him to begin building his fortress home, to turn it into what is arguably the greatest pirate haven in the history of the world. But from that point, John Churcher would sail on to St. Augustine Bay. Goods that the Signet pirates could use to set themselves up, stuff they really needed. If you found yourself wondering, after the raid on the Gate of Tears, what the pirates from the Signet who decided to stay there at St. Augustine Bay did with their winnings, 1,100 pounds, remember, they spent it on stuff like this. And with all of that money in his possession, John Churcher sailed to what Baldridge calls Mauritania. We would call it Mauritius, a small island group southeast of Madagascar that was at this point held by the French. That's where he bought his slaves, which was super illegal. Maybe arguably more illegal than what Henry Every and the other interlopers were up to on the continent. Not the slaving, that was absolutely legal in the eyes of everyone, and not breaking down carefully forged alliances with the locals on the mainland. No, what they were doing was buying slaves from the enemy. They were aiding their French rivals, and the RAC really hated it when people did that. But of course they didn't know about this particular exchange. John Churcher did not sail for any major port in the Atlantic world. Instead, he sailed discreetly to Nassau. Cadwell Jones, governor of the Bahamas, bought nearly half of the cargo, human beings that had been bought with the profit that Churcher had earned on this voyage. The other half, that which had been bought with the profits provided by Frederick Phillips' goods, would go to Carolina. This was extremely illegal, very much outside the law, but it was also extremely profitable. Enterprising plantation owners from the West Indies to the Carolinas and even up to New York, those who were in the know at least, well, they had a new supply of relatively cheap slave labor available in Nassau and Charlestown. That's the business model for these interlopers. That's the business that Frederick Phillips had invested in. It was earning men like him and Cadwell Jones a ton of profit. But that profit wasn't going to those who were actually doing the work. Those who were taking on the greatest risk, those who were in constant danger of being found by the Royal Africa Company, of being hanged or sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Men like John Churcher, the interlopers, were making pennies on the dollar. And that included blades like Long Ben Every. It wasn't a great deal. So in the weeks to come, we're going to discuss how these interlopers turned from the slavers' round and this international slavers conspiracy into the pirate round. After, naturally, Thomas Tew showed them how it was done. But not next time. Next time we're going to talk about that doctor in Carolina, Charleston specifically. We're going to talk about his role in founding the Carolina colony and his association with pirates like John Churcher and Robert Searle. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who has helped to support the show, all of our patrons on Patreon, everybody who has left us ratings or reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show. You all make it possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, thank you for listening. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.